Welcome to Godless and Grounded. Imagine someone telling you that there exists a being who can do absolutely anything. No limitation, no restriction, no boundary whatsoever. This being can make the impossible possible and can bend logic itself. At first, this might sound powerful and impressive, but the more we think about it carefully, the more problems appear. The very idea of omnipotence, which means unlimited power, is not just difficult to grasp, but actually collapses under the weight of logic. When you look closer, it turns out that omnipotence is not just unlikely, but a complete contradiction in itself. The problem starts when you try to define what all-powerful really means. If we say someone can do anything, then that must include things that are logically contradictory. But if logical contradictions are included, the whole concept falls apart. For example, can an all-powerful being create a square circle? Can it create a triangle with 4 sides? These are not things that can possibly exist, not because of human weakness, but because they are nonsensical combinations of words. A circle by definition cannot have corners, and a triangle cannot have 4 sides. So if we say that an omnipotent being can create such things, then we are talking about something meaningless. And if we say that even an omnipotent being cannot create them, then it means there are limits to what it can do. Either way, the concept destroys itself. This becomes clearer with the classic paradox. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then it cannot lift the stone, which means there is something it cannot do. If the answer is no, then it cannot create such a stone, which also means there is something it cannot do. In both cases, omnipotence turns into a contradiction. The problem is not with the stone or the lifting, but with the very definition of unlimited power. It cannot logically exist without falling apart. Sometimes believers respond by saying that omnipotence does not include logical contradictions. They argue that an all-powerful being can do everything that is logically possible, but not what is logically impossible. At first, this seems like a clever answer, but it has problems too. If the being is bound by logic, then it is not truly unlimited. Logic is greater than the being, because logic is the rule book that even God cannot break. That makes logic more powerful than omnipotence. This also raises the question, who created logic? If God is under its rule, then God is not ultimate. And if God created logic, then God could have created a world where contradictions make sense, but we see that contradictions can never make sense. That shows the concept is flawed from the ground up. Another way to see the problem is to think about perfection. If a being is already perfect, can it change? If it changes, then either it becomes better, which means it was not perfect before, or it becomes worse, which means it lost its perfection. So a perfect being cannot change, but if it cannot change, then there is something it cannot do. That means it is not omnipotent. Perfection and omnipotence cannot exist together without clashing. The idea that one being can be perfect, all-knowing, and all-powerful at the same time ends up in logical knots. Think about everyday examples. Imagine someone says they are the fastest runner in the world and can outrun anyone. That sounds like a clear claim, but if they say they can run faster than themselves, then the claim becomes nonsense. Being able to outrun yourself is not an achievement, it is a contradiction. The same applies to omnipotence. Saying a being can do anything sounds simple, but when you test it against contradictions, it collapses. Let us also think about free will. If an omnipotent being gave humans free will, then it cannot control our choices without taking away that free will. But if it cannot control our choices while still allowing us to be free, then there is something it cannot do. If it can override our choices at any time, then our free will was never real to begin with. Either way, omnipotence and human freedom cannot fully coexist without contradiction. This also makes religious claims weaker, because many faiths insist on both free will and divine omnipotence at the same time. Another contradiction arises with morality. If an omnipotent being is all-powerful and all-good, then why does evil exist? The standard religious answer is free will. But if free will requires the existence of evil, then the being was not powerful enough to design a world with free will, and without evil. That means omnipotence failed. If we say evil is necessary, then the being is limited. If we say evil is unnecessary but still exists, then the being either allowed it or created it, which makes it not all good. The triangle of omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and the existence of evil cannot logically stand together. We can also look at time itself. Can an omnipotent being change the past? If yes, then the past is no longer the past, which destroys the meaning of time. If no, then the being is limited. Either way, omnipotence loses. Can it create a world where it never existed? If yes, then it ceases to be eternal. If no, then there is something it cannot do. Again, omnipotence becomes impossible. The very nature of time and causality shows that unlimited power is logically incoherent. Now let us step back and look at real life. When people imagine omnipotence, they usually project human desires for ultimate control. A child might wish their parent could fix any problem instantly. A person in danger might wish for a rescuer who can do absolutely anything. But in reality, every form of power we know is limited. Governments have limits. Technology has limits. Even the most powerful humans face boundaries of biology and physics, so the idea of a power without limits does not come from evidence, but from imagination. It is a human fantasy projected onto the universe. And when fantasies are tested against logic, they do not survive. We can also compare omnipotence with mathematics. In math, infinity is not a number you can reach or manipulate freely. It is a concept with strict rules. You cannot say that infinity is bigger than infinity plus 1, because infinity is not like regular numbers. In the same way, saying a being can do absolutely everything is not a meaningful description. It is a misuse of language. Just as infinity must follow logical rules, power must also follow logical boundaries. Without logic, the concept becomes nonsense. Consider also the problem of self-limitation. If an omnipotent being wanted to limit its own power, could it? If yes, then after limiting itself, it is no longer omnipotent. If no, then it was never omnipotent because it cannot do that. Both outcomes deny the original claim. This shows that omnipotence is not a property that can logically exist. It is like a square circle, only dressed in theological language. The contradictions keep multiplying. Can an omnipotent being make 2 plus 2 equal 5? If yes, then mathematics collapses, and we can no longer trust any truth. If no, then it is limited. Can it create another omnipotent being? If yes, then there are 2 unlimited beings, and if one is truly unlimited, it must have power over the other, which means the other is not unlimited. If no, then there is something it cannot do. Every path leads to contradiction. Even in ordinary life, we avoid contradictions because they have no real meaning. If a person says they are both alive and dead at the same time, we know something is wrong. If a student says they passed and failed the same exam, we ask them to clarify because it cannot be both. But when it comes to religion, people suddenly allow contradictions under the label of mystery. They say that God's omnipotence is beyond logic, but if logic cannot apply, then words lose meaning. If we cannot use logic, then saying God is omnipotent is as empty as saying God is flibber-flabber. Without logic, nothing meaningful is being said. Faith without logic is not knowledge. It is just belief in words. This becomes even more troubling when you realize that omnipotence is often used as a foundation for worship. People are told to obey, pray, and sacrifice because God is all-powerful. But if omnipotence itself is incoherent, then the reason for worship collapses. You cannot base your life on a concept that dissolves under the slightest logical pressure. It would be like building a house on quicksand and pretending the ground is solid. When we study history, we also see that the idea of omnipotence evolved over time. In many ancient religions, gods were powerful but not unlimited. They had rival gods, weaknesses, and mistakes. Only later, especially in monotheistic traditions, did the idea of omnipotence appear as a way to make their god supreme over all others. It was less about truth and more about politics and authority. By claiming their God was all-powerful, religious leaders could demand absolute obedience from followers. But when this political claim is tested by logic, it turns out to be impossible. Omnipotence was never a truth. It was an invention to secure control. So the conclusion becomes clear. Omnipotence is not just unlikely, it is impossible. It contradicts itself in every direction. It fails with logical contradictions, with morality, with time, with perfection, with free will, with mathematics, and with history. It is not a concept of power, but a misuse of language that turns into nonsense. When people insist that God is omnipotent, they are holding on to a word that has no coherent meaning. The moment you examine it carefully, it falls apart. One of the most overlooked contradictions is that omnipotence cannot coexist with omniscience. If a being is all-knowing, it must already know what it will do tomorrow, next year, or 1,000,000 years from now. But if it already knows, then it cannot change its mind. Its actions are fixed. It is trapped in its own foreknowledge. That means it cannot truly have the power to do anything else. On the other hand, if it can freely change its mind, then it did not know the future with certainty. In other words, you cannot be both all-knowing and all-powerful at the same time without falling into contradiction. Religious traditions often try to combine these traits, but logic shows they do not fit together. We can also think about omnipotence in terms of personal identity. Imagine a being that is all-powerful deciding to erase its own existence. If it succeeds, then it no longer exists, so it is no longer omnipotent. If it fails, then it is not omnipotent because it could not erase itself. Either way, the concept destroys itself. The very act of questioning whether omnipotence can undo itself shows that it cannot logically hold together. A simple but powerful way to see the contradiction is through language. The word can usually applies to actions that are coherent. We can ask whether someone can lift a box or can run a mile. But when we say, can an omnipotent being make a square circle, we are no longer asking about action. We are combining words in a meaningless way. The question itself has no real subject, like asking, can you eat a color? Or, can you drink a sound? These are not real tasks. So when people say that God can do anything, they are mixing tasks that are meaningful with tasks that are meaningless and pretending they are all the same. That is not a definition of power. It is confusion dressed up as greatness. Another important point is that if omnipotence existed, it would destroy the idea of natural order. The laws of physics, mathematics, and logic would not be stable. We could not trust that gravity would hold us to the ground tomorrow, or that 2 plus 2 would equal 4, or that contradictions would remain impossible. But we do live in a world where these rules hold with perfect reliability. Airplanes fly because physics works the same every time. Computers calculate because mathematics does not break. Bridges stand because logic and engineering are dependable. If omnipotence could override any rule at any time, our world would collapse into chaos. The fact that it does not is strong evidence that omnipotence does not exist in reality. Think also about responsibility. If a being is omnipotent, then every event that happens must in some sense be chosen or allowed by it. Natural disasters, diseases, wars, and suffering all fall under its control. If it has the power to prevent them but does not, then it is morally questionable. If it cannot prevent them, then it is not omnipotent. Either way, the claim fails. This is why theologians constantly struggle with the problem of evil. The idea of omnipotence makes the problem worse, not better. A limited God could at least be excused for failing to stop some evils, but an unlimited God has no excuse at all. Let us bring in a practical example. Suppose someone claims that their boss at work is all-powerful within the company. At first, you might think they mean the boss has the final authority, but if you press the claim further, it makes no sense. Can the boss work in every department at the same time? Can the boss both fire and not fire an employee simultaneously? Can the boss make contradictory policies apply together? Obviously not. The phrase all-powerful boss is just exaggeration. In the same way, all-powerful God is exaggeration taken to a cosmic scale. The moment you test it with contradictions, it unravels. Another interesting point is how omnipotence interacts with free will among other beings. If humans have true freedom, then there must be things even God cannot predict or control. But if God already knows and controls everything, then humans have no freedom at all. Religious traditions often want both, but the two cannot exist together. It is like saying a chess player allows their opponent total freedom, while at the same time guaranteeing the outcome of every move. It cannot be both. The idea of omnipotence once again clashes with reality. When we study theology, we also see that different traditions define omnipotence differently to avoid these contradictions. Some say it means power over all things that are possible. Others say it means sovereignty over creation. Others define it as having no equal in power. Each attempt shows that the pure idea of unlimited power cannot stand on its own. It must be modified, watered down, or restricted in order to make any sense. But once it is restricted, it is no longer truly omnipotence. It is just very great power. So the claim that God is omnipotent is either incoherent or false advertising. There is also the psychological aspect. People want to believe in an omnipotent being because it gives comfort. If you feel helpless, the thought that someone all-powerful is watching over you can bring relief. If life feels unfair, the belief that a powerful judge will set things right in the end can ease anxiety. But emotional comfort does not equal logical truth. Just because a child wishes for a superhero parent who can do anything does not mean such a parent exists. The desire for omnipotence is real, but the concept itself remains impossible. In fact, omnipotence can be dangerous as an idea. When leaders or rulers are compared to gods, they sometimes claim near unlimited power for themselves. History is filled with kings, emperors, and dictators who presented themselves as chosen by an all-powerful god or as reflections of that god's power. By tying their authority to omnipotence, they demanded obedience and crushed opposition. But in practice, none of them were unlimited. They all faced defeat, death, and collapse. The idea of omnipotence became a political tool rather than a truth. It was used to control people, not to describe reality. We can also see the contradiction by thinking about limits themselves. A being without limits cannot define itself because definition requires boundaries. To say something is round means it is not square. To say something is red means it is not blue. To say something is finite means it is not infinite. But if a being has no limits at all, then it has no definition. It is not this, not that, not anything. It collapses into meaninglessness. Omnipotence is so unlimited that it cancels itself out. Some might argue that humans simply cannot understand omnipotence, and that it is a mystery beyond our logic. But if that is true, then we should not claim to know it exists at all. If it cannot be described without contradiction, then we cannot say anything about it with confidence. Saying, it exists but we cannot understand it, is no different from saying it might as well not exist. If logic cannot touch it, then it is outside our ability to even discuss meaningfully. In that case, every claim about omnipotence becomes empty noise. This is why philosophers from ancient times to today have pointed out the impossibility of omnipotence. Epicurus in Greece questioned divine power because of the existence of evil. In later centuries, thinkers like Thomas Aquinas tried to limit the definition of omnipotence to only what is logically possible. Modern philosophers and logicians have sharpened the paradoxes even further. The more it is studied, the clearer the contradiction becomes. Omnipotence is not a deep mystery waiting to be solved. It is a self-defeating concept. Let us bring this down to everyday reasoning again. If someone told you that their car could drive faster than any car, you might believe them if they gave evidence. But if they told you that their car could drive faster than itself, you would immediately recognize the nonsense. If someone told you their phone could store unlimited pictures, you might ask about memory space. But if they told you their phone could store more pictures than an infinite amount, you would know it is absurd. Omnipotence is exactly this kind of absurdity dressed up in religious language. When tested against reason, it makes no sense. Even religious scriptures reflect this tension. In some passages, God is said to be able to do all things. In others, there are limits. For example, God cannot lie, cannot change, cannot be tempted. Each tradition quietly admits limits while still using the label of omnipotence. This inconsistency shows that even within religion, the idea does not truly work. Believers must pick and choose which limits they accept, while pretending the word all-powerful still applies, but words lose meaning when stretched this far. So in the end, the case is overwhelming. Omnipotence is not just hard to believe, it is logically impossible. It cannot exist because it contradicts itself in every form. It fails when tested by logic, by morality, by free will, by perfection, by time, by mathematics, and even by history. It collapses into incoherence and meaninglessness. The belief survives only because people accept it emotionally without testing it rationally. But once tested, it vanishes like smoke. When we remove the illusion of omnipotence, we can see reality more clearly. Power in the universe is always limited. Stars burn out, galaxies collide. Humans live and die. Even the strongest forces of nature operate within rules. Accepting limits is not a weakness, it is honesty. The fantasy of omnipotence may comfort some, but truth is found in reason, not in contradiction. If we truly value logic and evidence, we must let go of the impossible idea that anyone, divine or otherwise, can do absolutely everything.